Good morning. I hope you all have had a wonderful weekend. I am on the struggle bus this morning with my technology, and so I hope that you can hear me with this microphone. All right. So, this is the review of week 3, and then we'll discuss a little bit about what's upcoming for this week 4. Probably many of you would agree, or I would assume that you would agree, this is the most boring section of this entire class, but it is important information. I want to go over your discussion board posts. Caleb did chapter 7, number 2, identify and describe the various sources of measurement error and their related reliability precision estimates. What are the advantages and disadvantages of each method? And a lot of this information is a good foundation if you plan on going into teaching and teaching at a university that is heavily focused on research. Then you will have to know all of this because you will have to decide these are things that you will have to be doing in the development of your research or the development of assessments if that's what you're going to do. But for the most part, most of us need to understand this information for the purpose of selecting and understanding the results of assessments that we're using. Caleb, you mentioned the time sampling error, which is the measure of error for whether or not a test can be done over and over again. So, like kids taking the ACT and the SAT over and over again. The other thing is, the content sampling would also be part of that because each time you take the ACT or the SAT, you get different questions. And so they have to be sure that the content that they're testing serves the purposes. Now, I've already shared how I feel about any kind of test being the only factor in making decisions. And so, regardless of how well the constructs are tested. And the reason is because, like I said before, not everyone are good test takers. The other thing is that there are always outliers. And I may have mentioned this before, but you always have to remember that when we are talking about statistics of any kind, whether it's regarding assessments, whether it's regarding the results of research, and we say statistically, this, majority, like I say oftentimes, statistically, majority of individuals who have autism also have ADHD, but the same is not true in reverse. Okay, research shows that over 50% of individuals who have autism also have ADHD. That is not 100%. That does not mean that everyone who has autism also has ADHD. It just means that there is a high percentage of individuals who. So we always have to remember the outliers, okay? The, results are put on a bell curve. The norm is the middle, right? The mean is the middle, and then the standard deviation that is determined, usually 10 from the mean. And so depending on the assessment, outside of the norm is more than one standard deviation outside of the, away from the mean. Sometimes it's 2 standard deviations. This is why understanding the statistics are important, is because you have to understand the statistics in order to understand the results. I will also say that time sampling error is something that, there's different types of assessments that you can give clients when they're coming in each week for sessions. I used to see a therapist that had this little scale that he did with each session, and honestly, I hated it. And so I started doing something similar to that when I started in practice. And then I was like, I didn't like doing this as a client. So why am I trying to do this? I do love data. And so that was what made me want to do that. But it was very time consuming as a client and it was very time consuming as a therapist. And that's great if that's what you want to do. But then the question regarding time sampling becomes, how accurate is the information that your clients are giving you from session to session when using a measure like that? Even though it's just a screening tool, even though it's a measure to help you track progress or where the client is at, you also have to be paying attention to, when the client comes in and marks everything is wonderful, but then comes in, there's this incongruence with their presentation and the things they're talking about, but yet they circled that everything is fine on your little, pre-session measure. Obviously, that's not reliable information. So the text primarily is talking about, like research and formal assessments, but those are the kind of things that you need to consider in real life. I will also touch on regarding the content sampling, but one of the things that it took me a minute to really wrap my brain around is that these formal assessments are not actually identifying in a way that you see it the specific diagnostic criteria of certain diagnoses as it is lined out in the DSM. So, the reason that I point that out is because often, if you're just using formal assessments to make diagnoses, even let's just use something as simple as the Beck Depression Scale. Okay. So if you give a client the Beck Depression Scale, and oftentimes counselors will use that at the beginning of, the Beck Anxiety and Depression Scale, at the beginning. So it's going to say mild, moderate, moderately severe depression. What does that mean diagnostically? And how are you interpreting it as a clinician? Does mild depression on the Beck Depression Inventory mean mild major depressive disorder? Not necessarily. I oftentimes will diagnose anxiety disorder unspecified or depression disorder unspecified because a client has symptoms of depression, has some symptoms of depression or some symptoms of anxiety, but they don't actually rise to the clinical level of generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder as it is outlined in the DSM. So, what I am going to emphasize here and maybe expound on later is to remember that all of these assessments, the ones that are highly reliable and valid and are trusted in our community, okay, that's all well and good. But the DSM has specific diagnostic criteria, which we are trying to identify in order to make accurate diagnoses. And that is why just using one assessment is not okay. That is why understanding the assessments that you're giving is very important. That is why collecting as much data as possible before making a diagnosis is the best, is ideal, because individuals can have, okay, I'll use this as an example, and I don't remember if I've said this before, but I tell people all the time, just because somebody made you mad doesn't mean they have narcissistic personality disorder. That's like a big thing these days. Social media is all a buzz about narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. And so now everybody that makes you mad is a narcissist. Okay. No, that is not how diagnosing works. The DSM, there are 9 potential symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. The DSM says that an individual has to have 5 of those symptoms in order to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, now here's the thing: if you live with or work with someone who has 3 of those symptoms, 3 symptoms of narcissism can be very difficult to deal with, but that does not narcissism make. Okay. That is an extreme and kind of, funny example, but the same is true of everything. Okay. People can have symptoms of ADHD and not have ADHD. People can have symptoms of autism and not have autism. There is a diagnostic criteria that we are looking for to identify these disorders. And that is what these assessments are trying to do. I am not an expert on every assessment that is out there. So let me say this: that there might be some out there that I don't do that actually do line out the diagnostic criteria. The BASC 3 does at the end give, like matching diagnostic symptoms. So there are times where it does point to that, but a lot of times the information is just summaries, and it's this, like the book points out, like Caleb pointed out in his discussion, that the, content sampling, that it's not possible to test every construct and, all of the different things. And so they have to narrow it down, which is why so much research goes into developing these assessments. So, anyway, all right, into rater differences. Some assessments are more impacted by this than others. The ADOS can be very subjective because it is based on observation and what the clinician writes down. So the training is very important, and understanding how to administer the test is very important. I mean, it's always important, but it's especially important when it's a situation like that where the test is more subjective. Even with the ones that seem more straightforward, your clinical perspective is still important. Your knowledge of the client and your observations and, gathering information and data from other sources still has to play into how you interpret the information that comes from different measures. All right, so great job, guys. Amanda addressed the question regarding a teacher creating a midterm exam. And so that was chapter 7, discussion 4. Yes, I agree with all of the things that you said. I also agree with Caleb, where he said that the reliability could be thrown out the window if someone intentionally or unintentionally bombed. If there's a curve that makes someone who failed pass because everything is distributed, then that's not going to be a reliable or accurate result. I've already said, I don't like tests. I agree with you. I don't like it when they're too short. I have had midterm exams that were only 10 questions, and that's maddening. And I have also had situations where you get tested on things that was never, discussed, was nowhere. So test taking can be very frustrating. But yes, but I will say that when I was in my education specialist program, actually several of the classes that I took, they were independent studies. My professor was crafting them specifically for me. And the 2 or 3 times that I did that, he had me create quizzes for each module of the training that I was going through and all this. And let me tell you something, creating test questions is not as easy as you think. I can't remember. I know one of the assignments that I was kicking around was having you all create a quiz, because I do think it's a very good exercise. It is surprisingly difficult to create good test questions, even for, in the class. And so sometimes when you know the material so well that, the test question makes sense to you, but it may not be it may not make sense to the person that it's intended for, which is another thing that test writers in any position need to consider. So Bradley responded to prompt 1 about the statistical concepts such as scales of measurement, central tendency, and variability are important in counseling because they allow counselors to better understand the assessment results more clearly. And so you use the example of if a client scores high on the GAD 7 and being able to explain what that means. The GAD is a pretty straightforward measure. It is diagnostic, but it can also be used as a screening tool. Like, that's often used instead of the Beck anxiety. So, yes, just like I said before regarding the Beck. So, the GAD does an interval scale, just like I was talking before, and it says 25 is mild anxiety, noticeable but manageable. Okay, so then the question is that, does mild anxiety mean that the individual meets diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder and it's mild? Or does that mean that the client is experiencing some symptoms of anxiety but doesn't meet diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder? So you would have to read the manual for each assessment for each measure to understand what those scores mean. And depending on the measure, somewhere in the book, it talks about the fact that You will not have to calculate a lot of these things because this is information that is produced in the results. A lot of this stuff you can now do online and it's scored for you. And so then you just get the results report. You have to know how to interpret that and understand what that means. But yes, I mean, all of these measures, just like I already talked about, and Bradley, you're 100% correct, is that the importance of understanding what these numbers are is knowing what they mean. Not just the measure says, you know, high anxiety, but what does that mean? The other thing is that did you just give the GAD? Because what if there are other things going on? Because there's also different kinds of anxieties. The GAD is great and it's very useful, but just knowing that somebody has anxiety is only part of the picture. What is the anxiety from? Do they have anxiety because they have ADHD? Do they have anxiety because they have PTSD? Do they have anxiety because they have OCD? I mean, you see what I'm saying? Is it triggered by specific things? What is going on there? All right. So, this is a very difficult subject to summarize. It's actually a large behind the scenes part of doing assessments. This is definitely the boring, yuck, seemingly not interesting stuff, unless you're interested in doing assessments and, interested in what the data means. I will also say that even if you never ever do a single assessment in your practice or wherever you work, you still need to understand statistics and understand what these things mean in order to be able to understand and interpret research well. It drives me bananas when I hear people quote statistics on the news and, politicians using statistics and all of this, because the fact of the matter is that is not the whole story. Just like I said earlier, there's the norm and then there's always outliers. I go to the same ADHD conference every year at University of Alabama, and there's several doctors there that I love listening to. Okay, had to switch gears because my phone is now having issues. Anyway, the doctor at the ADHD conference is asked every year, about sugar and red dye. And every year he says, research shows that sugar and red dye do not cause or impact ADHD. However, if you give your child sugar and red dye and they get super hyperactive or have some kind of reaction, then don't give them sugar or red dye. And he talks about the fact that, research says that it does not have an impact, okay, because there is the bell curve, right? So the norm, what research shows is that overwhelmingly those two factors are not an issue when it comes to ADHD. However, you got these little tails of the bell curve out here, right? So there may be, small pockets on the outside of the norm that it does have an impact. And, research and statistical information is not about certainty. It's about probability. It is so important. Humility is required, okay? Humility is required. You can literally go out and find research that says whatever you want it to say. We are supposed to practice based on things that are empirically sound. So you need to understand what that means, because in order for you to practice with methods that are empirically sound, you need to understand what research means. So it's not, understanding these statistics is not just about interpreting assessments. It is also about interpreting research. So, great job. All right, let's see. Now, let me look into the future for this week and see what we're doing. Week 4, the assessment process, chapter 9. You just have one chapter to read this week. So you may want to use this week to start reading ahead in the next week. And while you're at it, I will just go ahead and say that I have not created your midterm yet, so if you would like to offer up some prayers for me while I work on that in the next week or so. I was so hoping to have the entire class mapped out by now, and life, y'all. All right, so let's see. Selecting, administering, scoring, and interpreting assessment results. I'm not going to go into a lot regarding this week. Read the chapter, answer the prompt, and I will review and get back to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about this after the fact. But I will also give you a heads up if you have not looked ahead for week 5. It is 3 chapters of reading, and there are 2 assignments under the discussion board. And so one is for you to respond via email to me directly by Sunday. So this is next week, not this week. And the other is a regular discussion board post. So please be aware of that, since this week is light in reading and you only have 1 chapter and 1 discussion board post. My recommendation would be that you go ahead and work ahead into week 5 and start your reading, and make sure that you're looking at that assignment that has 2 parts. All right, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day.